This 1910, on a quiet river in Maryland. A hunter named Atlee Langford steps into his boat before sunrise. In his hands is something brand new, a shotgun that can fire 5 shots without reloading. By the time he puts that gun down for good, he will have killed over 35,000 ducks with it. Not as a hobby, as a business. Ducks shipped by rail straight to restaurant kitchens in New York and London. Now think about tonight. You're probably going to eat chicken. It's the most eaten meat on the planet. But rewind just a century and a half, and chicken was a minor player at the dinner table. Wild birds still supplied millions of meals. Ducks, geese, pigeons, and quail shipped to city markets by the millions. So what happened? How does an entire food source, one that fed humans for thousands of years, just vanish from our plates? The answer involves a bird that once blocked out the sun and is now extinct forever. A wartime chicken black market patrolled like a smuggling operation. A parasite that turns duck meat into something that looks like grains of rice. And a 1948 science contest that helped create the modern meat chicken filling supermarket shelves right now. Stick around, because after this you'll never look at a chicken nugget the same way again. For most of human history, you didn't buy dinner. You looked up. Dig into an ancient campsite and you'll find bird bones scarred with cut marks. Proof that early humans hunted waterfowl and game birds season after season, generation after generation, without a single domesticated chicken in sight. But nowhere does this get stranger than ancient Egypt. Egyptians didn't just eat wild birds. They mummified millions of them as offerings to the gods. For decades, this puzzled scientists. Were these birds farmed like some ancient assembly line? So researchers did something clever. They studied the chemical fingerprints locked inside the bird's bones and feathers, a kind of biological passport recording everywhere those birds had traveled and eaten. And the results told a wild story. Every bird was different. Different diets, different migration routes, different lives. These weren't farmed animals. They were wild birds harvested by the millions on a scale we'd call industrial today, for 1,000 years before industry existed. The Romans, meanwhile, were doing something quietly revolutionary. A writer named Columella described a trick. Steal a wild duck's eggs, slide them under a broody hen, and let her hatch them. Raised that way, he wrote, the ducklings would lay aside their wild nature. Read that again. That's not just a farming tip. That's the first rough sketch of domestication itself, written 2,000 years before anyone had a word for it. By medieval Europe, wild ducks and geese were currency, literally. Tenant farmers paid their landlords in wildfowl instead of coin. And when colonists crossed the Atlantic into North America, they stepped into something almost unimaginable. Skies so thick with wild turkeys and waterfowl that early settlers barely had to hunt. They just had to be there. One bird, in particular, defined that abundance more than any other. Flocks of the passenger pigeon were so massive, so dense, that witnesses said they blotted out the sun for hours at a time. Remember that bird, because its story is about to take a very dark turn. For thousands of years, this system worked. Then, in the 1800s, something changed. Hunting stopped being about feeding a family and became a business. It was called market hunting, and it moved fast and it moved big. Hunters weren't just carrying shotguns anymore. They were building weapons that shouldn't have existed. Picture a shotgun over 10 feet long, bolted directly to the bow of a boat, so heavy it needed 2 men to load it. It was called a punt gun, and a single blast could kill 100 birds at once. Market hunters up and down the Mississippi Flyway routinely harvested thousands of ducks and geese in a single season, and some built entire businesses around it, including custom freezers with foot-thick, sawdust-packed walls, engineered just to keep the birds cold enough to ship them hundreds of miles to city meat markets. Felt limitless. It wasn't. Here's the problem nobody accounted for. A wild duck doesn't reproduce like a factory restocks a warehouse. She lays a small clutch once a year if the weather cooperates. There's no overtime shift for nature. So while hunters kept pulling birds out of the sky faster and faster, nothing was putting them back. And then the unthinkable happened. The passenger pigeon, the bird that once turned daylight into shadow, didn't just decline. It went extinct. Not endangered. Not rare. Gone. Forever. The last one, a bird named Martha, died alone in a Cincinnati zoo in 1914, the final survivor of a species that had once numbered in the billions. That wasn't just sad. It was a warning shot, and it was about to force the government's hand. Extinction has a way of making people pay attention, and in the early 1900s, lawmakers finally did. It started small, a law making it illegal to ship illegally hunted birds across state lines. That alone gutted the market hunter's entire business model. Then, in 1918, came the law that changed everything. Selling almost any wild native bird became a federal crime, virtually overnight. You could still hunt for sport. You just couldn't sell what you shot. Here's where most people get the story wrong. It's tempting to think, oh, hunting wild birds just became illegal. That's why we stopped eating them. But that gets the order of events backwards. The laws didn't cause the shortage. The shortage caused the laws. By the time politicians acted, the damage was already done. This was the emergency brake slammed on a car that had already started crashing. But an emergency brake doesn't feed anyone. And almost overnight, there was a hole in the American dinner table where wild birds used to be. Something had to fill it. What filled it would come from a place nobody expected. A chicken beauty pageant. Here's a fact that sounds made up. It isn't. The chicken sitting in your fridge right now can trace its bloodline directly back to the winner of a contest. Right after World War II, a grocery executive named Howard Pierce looked at the birds available at the time and wasn't impressed. Skinny, small-chested, barely worth the effort. So he did something almost absurd. He launched a nationwide competition called the Chicken of Tomorrow. Farmers from 42 states shipped in fertilized eggs. Every chick was hatched under identical conditions, raised side by side, then judged on 18 separate traits. Growth speed, meat yield, efficiency, even how clean the feathers plucked. Two men walked away as legends of an industry that didn't even know it needed them yet. One had crossed a Cornish rooster with a New Hampshire red hen and gotten explosive growth. The other had bred a pure white bird whose feathers left no dark marks under the skin after plucking. Breeders combined the two bloodlines, and that cross became the ancestor of almost every chicken eaten on Earth today. Scientists hadn't just improved an animal. They'd redesigned one. Here's the part that actually explains everything. A wild bird's body is built by millions of years of evolution to survive. Hollow bones for flight, lean muscle for endurance, energy burned escaping predators and migrating thousands of miles. A modern chicken was bred for the opposite goal entirely. Forget flying. Forget surviving. Just grow. And it worked almost too well. In 1980, it took nearly 2 months to raise a chicken to market weight. Today, barely a month. A modern chicken turns food into meat with brutal, almost unfair efficiency. A wild duck, by comparison, spends most of its food just staying alive. Flying, foraging, keeping warm. A chicken spends almost all of it becoming meat. Nature built a survivor. Science built something else entirely, an animal optimized for one job only. And once that animal existed, the wild bird never stood a chance in the marketplace again. But here's a twist that rarely makes it into the story. Even if wild birds had remained abundant, and even if they'd stayed perfectly legal to sell, they still came with risks that farm-raised poultry could largely engineer away. Take a condition doctors call coturnism. Migrating quail sometimes feed on toxic seeds they're personally immune to. The poison doesn't hurt the bird, but it builds up in the meat. And when a person eats that quail hours later, their muscles can begin breaking down from the inside. This isn't folklore. It's been documented since biblical times, and it's still diagnosed today. Or picture cutting into a duck breast and finding it filled with small, cream-colored cysts running through the muscle. A parasitic infection hunters nicknamed, bluntly, rice breast disease. Then there's lead. Old-school hunting relied on lead shot, and when it strikes a bird, it doesn't stay in one tidy piece. It shatters into microscopic fragments scattered invisibly through the meat. Fragments too small to see, too small to feel even while cooking. Health agencies specifically warn pregnant women and young children to avoid lead shot game entirely, because even tiny amounts of lead can quietly, permanently affect a developing brain. Now picture a modern poultry farm instead, climate-controlled, feed monitored down to the gram, every single bird inspected before it reaches a store shelf. It isn't just more efficient. It's dramatically, measurably safer. Before we land this plane, let's clear up 3 things people almost always get wrong. Myth 1. Wild birds are naturally poisonous. Not true. It's rare and almost always tied to a specific toxic plant a bird happened to eat, not something built into the bird itself. Myth 2. Wild bird meat just tastes better. That's opinion, not fact. Wild meat is leaner and stronger flavored because the muscle was built for flight, not for melting in your mouth. Myth 3. Wild birds basically disappeared. They didn't. Species like the snowy egret came roaring back once commercial hunting stopped. The skies aren't empty. We simply stopped treating them as a grocery store. So here's the real answer to the question we started with. Humans didn't stop eating wild birds because the sky ran dry, and we didn't stop simply because a law appeared out of nowhere. We stopped because an unsustainable system collided head-on with a growing world, and in the wreckage, science built something the wild could never be: predictable, scalable, and safe. Remember Atlee Lankford on that riverbank in 1910 holding a gun that could empty the sky? He had no idea he was living through the final chapter of a 10,000-year story, and he had no idea what would replace it. A bird literally engineered in a laboratory-style contest 3 decades later, built to do the one thing nature never optimized for: feed billions of people safely every single day. For thousands of years, humans hunted birds to survive. Today, birds are one of the few foods we no longer have to hunt at all. That shift didn't just change what's on your plate. It changed how an entire civilization feeds itself. If this changed the way you'll look at your next meal, hit subscribe because next time we're going somewhere just as strange. See you in the next one.